from the Walter H. Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford University. Oriana Skylar Mastro is a Center Fellow here at the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center and a Courtesy Assistant Professor of Political Science at Stanford University, where her research focuses on Chinese military and security policy, Asia-Pacific security issues, war termination, and coercive diplomacy. Along with her academic duties, Mastro continues to serve in the United States Air Force Reserve at the Pentagon as Deputy Director of Reserve Global China Strategy. Her most recent book, Upstart, How China Became a Great Power, was recently published by Oxford University Press. Dr. Mastro, thanks for doing a Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center book talk.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Your book, Upstart, uses a novel approach to analyze China's strategies over the last 30 years or so to rapidly grow its economy, foreign relations, and military readiness. Your methodology doesn't come purely from political science.
Right.
So can you break down your analysis of China's meteoric rise and how you came up with this approach?
Yeah, sure. I think there was personal experience and also some experience with the political science literature that inspired this book. So on the anecdotal side, anyone who works on China or any other country for that matter, you often find yourself not only in academic writing, but in policy advising, telling people it's not a good idea to mirror image, right? To assume that another country is like the United States when trying to understand it. While this is acceptable practice, everyone thinks mirror imaging is bad. People usually say it and then in the next sentence make an assumption about China based on our understanding of what the United States would do in that context. And so the political science literature does talk about emulation. And the idea is that to become a great power, you do what previous great powers did that were successful. You basically emulate the established great power. It is a theory that argues precisely that mirror imaging is not so bad because all countries act alike. When looking at China's rise, I recognized that as a rising power, you have a lot of different incentives. You have a weaker resource position, maybe being second mover in a certain area, you don't have certain advantages. You're a different country, and so there's some strategies or processes that don't suit you and your competitive advantages. And in thinking about this, you mentioned I worked with another literature. I turned to the business literature on competition. And this proved very fruitful for two reasons. First, the rise and fall of powers is a rare event in international relations. We study it because it's so impactful, but we don't have a lot of cases. While the start and end of companies is something for which there are thousands and thousands of cases. And because of that, there's a whole literature on how a startup, a new company, should try to approach competition. And when I read that literature, it really resonated for me about China's approach to competing with the United States. And so the book builds on the political science literature and the business literature to put forth this strategy, which I call the Upstart strategy, which is the mix of emulation or pursuing US strategies in similar areas where the United States is doing it, exploitation, which is adopting US strategies, but in different and new areas of competition where the United States isn't so present. And then entrepreneurial actions, which is when China does something completely differently. And the book consists of 22 case studies in the economic, military, and political realms that talk about when they emulated, when they exploited, and when they were more entrepreneurial in their approach, and then tries to put forth an argument about why a certain pathway was chosen at a given period of time.
Thanks for explaining that. If you were to boil your book down into one sentence, do you think this would be accurate? Don't assume China will act the same way as the United States or other would-be superpowers.
Exactly. Exactly. And then I would follow that up with a caveat or an additional statement, which is just because they do things differently doesn't mean it's ineffective.
In the three areas that you mentioned, emulation, exploitation, and entrepreneurship, can you provide a successful and unsuccessful example of each?
Right. So thanks for pointing that out. I don't want to give the impression that China is so strategic and everything they do is perfect. There are also examples in the book where I argue that they chose the wrong strategy. So there's sort of 5 factors that determine whether China chooses emulation, exploitation, or entrepreneurship. And those are things like whether or not they have competitive advantages, how they think the United States will respond. Will they see it as threatening or reassuring a certain Chinese behavior? The Chinese view on whether or not the US strategy is efficient or effective, and whether or not there are gaps to exploit to begin with. And then, in terms of that competitive advantage, also their own liabilities, which in this case includes a very strong focus on how it would impact Communist Party rule. And so I look at a lot of the Chinese literature to try to really understand why they choose one over the other. And this is very important because the rationale provides us insight into what would change, right? If the reason to do something different is, wow, US strategy is really great. We wish we could do that, but we're not powerful enough. Maybe as they become more powerful, they would change course. But if the rationale is, what the United States is doing is really stupid, then even as they become more powerful, they won't change course. So some of the examples there in the case studies, if you think about like the entrepreneurial approach, emulation, exploitation. In foreign policy, one area of emulation is China's approach to mediation diplomacy, right? They're trying to present themselves as an international mediator to buy power and influence in the international system, but also to reassure countries of, their responsible role in the international system. Exploitation is something like arms sales, in which the United States uses that as a tool of foreign policy. But in this case, China does sell arms, but only really to countries that can't buy them from the United States, right? So there's these gaps that they can exploit, and they sell them to countries that can't buy from the United States, either because of human rights embargoes, or they're just too poor to be able to afford those arms, or certain types of technologies like drones, for example, that the United States, due to some treaty obligations, couldn't sell. And then more entrepreneurial are things like strategic partnerships instead of alliances, right? China doesn't have formal alliances with countries. One of the failures of foreign policy is when I say they try to emulate in soft power. The Chinese do not have competitive advantages in soft power. It does not support CCP rule. Soft power is something that comes from civil society, which China doesn't have. So they spend a lot of money trying to promote that soft power image, but they still can't really catch up with the United States. In the military realm, where I work, my work is most heavily focused. Similar types of approaches, emulation. China does humanitarian aid and disaster relief or peacekeeping operations, the same way the United States does, again, because the United States has said those are very reassuring. In exploitation, one of the main things they do is something called the anti-access area denial strategy. And there's nothing that is about exploiting gaps and vulnerabilities more than this. It's the Chinese military spent a lot of time and effort trying to figure out where US gaps were and vulnerabilities, and they developed specific weapon systems and doctrines to target those. And then entrepreneurship, I talk about nuclear strategy and how they protect overseas interests, because China doesn't have overseas bases the way that the United States does. And they haven't relied on a large nuclear arsenal the way the United States has. And there's many other differences with their nuclear posture and strategy and organization and the such. And then the last chapter, and one of the failures there is aircraft carriers. Again, China spends a lot of time and effort and money building those aircraft carriers, and it doesn't even come close to reaching the capability that the United States has. And then the chapter on economics, I discuss things like their attempts to internationalize the renminbi, which is more like an emulation that hasn't been successful to date. Entrepreneurship, where I put the Belt and Road Initiative in that, and exploitation, which is partially BRI and also, free trade, and their approaches to free trade in some aspects is exploitation and in others emulation. And then, industrial policy, which is another thing that they do differently than the United States to promote innovation.
Before we take a look at foreign policy and economics, I have a somewhat offbeat question. I wonder if it's your background in the military and as a strategic planner that informed your tendency to avoid the use of normative language as much as possible. You state in your introduction, this book is not meant to be a condemnation of China, nor is it meant to praise the country. When I say that a strategy is effective or successful, I do not condone that approach. Was this a hard needle to thread? At times, you do seem to be somewhat in admiration of China's choices. On the other hand, when you talk about mediation, you say, whether mediation leads to conflict resolution is, for our purposes, a secondary consideration.
Right. Yeah.
See what I mean?
Yeah, and I think I also, like when I talked about Belt and Road, similar things, right? Whether Belt and Road is good for the countries that sign up to it, that's a separate question than whether it gives China power and influence. I don't know if it's so. I think I don't know if it's my military background to think more strategically about this, or that I decided to join the military because I'm naturally inclined to do so. But the problem is, and what I'm trying to get at here, and maybe a more diplomatic way, is the issue of China's rise and U.S. competition with China has become a highly sensitive and politicized topic um, among U.S. elites. I would say at universities in particular, but also in government. And as a researcher who works on these very sensitive areas, I find that people have a hard time, and why I had to write this whole book with so much data, right? Accepting new ideas that run contrary to their own value systems, right? What China does is not supposed to work. Or it's hard to believe that China is regime agnostic because as an autocracy, we have this notion that they prefer working with autocracies, which is actually not the case. And so I do think I try to be a little bit more pragmatic because for the United States to have the, effective and correct strategies, that we have to understand what the situation is first. Now, in terms of admiration, it's funny you say that. My husband always jokes that, people always think I'm a China hawk because I write a lot about conflict with China and actively like plan and think about conflict with China. And of course, in my US military role, spend a lot of time doing that. Though I'm obviously participating in this podcast in my civilian capacity. But I don't want us to be blind to the realities that a lot of what China does has been effective. And that's why I start out with the book. Political scientists would argue, what is success? It's hard to measure success. So I try to nip that question in the bud by having a whole chapter about different approaches and metrics for power, whether it is social power, discourse power, basically every political scientist and what they've said about what makes a country a great power, and show that China has met that standard. So whatever we think about China, whatever we think their impact is on the international world order, I think it's somewhat indisputable that over the past 25 years, when they went from a country with a smaller GDP than France, a non-existent, non-functional military, very few foreign relations, and not really participate in international institutions, to where they are today, that it has been impressive what they've managed to accomplish in the past 30 years.
Thanks. That's a very illuminating answer. Turning to foreign policy, in a section of your book called Manipulating International Institutions, you say, the logic that institutional enmeshment would lead to reform encouraged the United States to grant China most favored nation status in the 1990s and support its succession to the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So, was the United States duped or did it fool itself? Should it have blocked accession? Or were the United States and other nations short-sighted to assume that China would play strictly by the rules?
So I guess this is a great question because this really highlights the undercurrent about why I wrote this book. Um, I don't like to say that we underestimated or overestimated the Chinese threat. I just think we mischaracterized it. So in this case, for example, it's not like I think we shouldn't have, promoted Chinese involvement in the WTO. But again, because we saw that institution in a certain way, and we see international institutions largely in a certain way, and we understand how we interact with them, we assumed that's how China was going to interact with them. Now, in a lot of cases, especially with like the UN, and it's exactly China's working within the rules and norms of the international institution that has made them successful. The co-opting of the international institutions were things like, and I have a data set about this in the book, focusing on getting Chinese nationals in senior management positions and leadership positions so that they could set the agenda and direct the work of key international institutions. Now, is this not following the rules? Well, I think from the US perspective, it's more that what they ended up doing, they were more effective than we thought they'd be, and they were able to change the direction of the institution while following a lot of the rules within it. So the question is, and then there's some loopholes, like with trade organizations, China not following the rules in certain areas. It's like they see a loophole, they're going to exploit it. So the way I think about it is, if we just had thought a little bit more about those institutions and hadn't assumed that China was going to act the way we were going to act, then maybe we could have protected some aspects of it and created new norms or rules in certain areas to constrain Chinese behavior more. Like, to be a member of the UN Human Rights Commission or be at a high level, you have to subject yourself to more like internal reporting or verification on your human rights practices, or something that would have created a hurdle that China would have said, this isn't worth it to us. So I think part of the problem was, yeah, I mean, we assumed that China was going to see the world the way that we saw it once they became, participated more in it. And we also learned that a lot of things we think are rules are actually not. They're norms of behavior. And a lot of those norms of behavior weren't as strong as we thought they were. And so having to do more of the work to build international consensus on norms is now very important. But it's not so much, I think, the fault of China for recognizing those weaknesses and exploiting them. It's also on the United States for not recognizing those weaknesses and buttressing them as we got China more involved in the international order.
What about China's activities in the South China Sea? China ratified the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea in 1996. Why would it do that if the convention was going to cause China so much pushback a couple of decades later? Is it to some degree forced to engage in its current behavior because of its reliance on anti-access area denial strategy?
So this is, Chinese approach to lawfare, and I do talk about these gray zone activities in the book as being said somewhat entrepreneurial, and that they're different to how the U.S. military operates. But this is a good example of, so China signed UNCLOS, right? So they wanted to, but then they wanted to use that legal foundation as a framework for promoting their own understanding. So China then also added an addendum of their own domestic interpretations of what UNCLOS means, which undermines some of that power in terms of legitimacy, maybe not legally. And then they used that law to build their claim for control of the South China Sea. And so it's not, people always say China just says the South China Sea is theirs. It's actually much more complicated than that. It's multiple steps. They use the UNCLOS definition of internal waters, which are waterways, but like, river inside a country. Foreign powers are not allowed to sail down the Mississippi River. Some countries, because they are a collection of islands, they get this UNCLOS ruling that they are an archipelagic nation, meaning that you can't sail between the islands. So the first thing China did is sort of misapply this and say this applies to some of the islands in the South China Sea, right? So that those waterways are internal waters. So that's their first level of legal argument for why they control it. Then, because they treat those islands as a grouping, they measure the territorial sea and exclusive economic zone from that. Then the problem is the exclusive economic zones. It's what is the interpretation of the level of control a country has in that? There's gaps there, right? The United States says it's just economic activity that you are in control of. And China says that military vessels, by definition, don't constitute peaceful passage. So any sort of military activity, sailing, patrolling through another country's EEZ has to be declared. And it isn't only China that says this, right? Brazil, India, some other countries have similar views. So that it's hard. The United States, again, you need a consensus on some of these issues to make China really look bad. And so that's, the majority of their claims is actually using some of that international law, like misapplying it, and then engaging in these gray zone activities, which is using a lot of non-military vessels like coast guards and other law enforcement, risk manipulation, so engaging in dangerous activities to convince other countries to leave the area versus directly attacking them, as a way to operationalize that control. So again, we would say, okay, you've signed this and you're in violation of it, but they would say, no, we're not in violation of it. Let me tell you all the ways we aren't. And oh, by the way, the United States hasn't even ratified it, which makes it hard on the international stage for the United States to get the support to criticize China.
So I guess it's a combination of exploitation and an entrepreneurial subversion of understandings.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So that manipulation is very important, and only if you're a part of the group can you then sort of change what the group is doing.
Right. Turning to another big subject, Taiwan, which I guess falls under both headings of foreign policy and military strategy. You've spoken extensively about the possibility of war over Taiwan. I wonder if there's a chance that you yourself have fallen into the trap of looking at the situation through a traditional superpower lens. Could there be the possibility, maybe, that China would prefer to maintain the status quo with Taiwan, and that a U.S. misunderstanding of its wishes could create the very conflict that we're trying to avoid?
Well, I guess I was very vocal on the issue because the conventional wisdom was the opposite. The conventional wisdom, I think, largely until recently, was that, because China is so enmeshed in the global economy, they would never want to risk like the economic costs associated with taking Taiwan by force, that Taiwan was not, so important to them, that countries no longer use force to achieve territorial aims. And so what I tried to do in my work on Taiwan is to say, okay, the United States, you think that Taiwan isn't worth it, right? We think Taiwan wouldn't be worth it. But from the Chinese perspective, it is an extremely important interest, very connected to CCP legitimacy. And on top of that, while we assume, maybe like we assumed those international institutions would constrain China somehow, we assume that their role in the global economy has changed their thinking about the role of use of force. But from what I can tell of my interactions and interviews in China, as well as reading Chinese literature, that's just not the case. And indeed, a lot of these strategies I'd lay out about building power and influence were designed to neutralize responses to any sort of activities that China wants to engage in that the world might not like. For example, an attack on Taiwan. I don't focus heavily my own research on the economic realm, but in my discussions with leaders around the world, from Singapore to Japan to European countries, if asked if they would cease all trade with China, if China attacked Taiwan, the answer is usually no. And those strategic partnerships that I alluded to, most of them have a clause in which countries sign on to agreeing that they won't let political issues like Taiwan get in the way of their economic relationship. So that's kind of the Chinese use of economic power. And so I think I would say that I don't fall in the trap because what I'm trying to do is explain that China views the situation, its leadership measures the costs and benefits differently. And while we might think there's all these constraints to Chinese behavior, those are not actually in place. And then added on to the military balance of power, that hopefully my readers get a sense of the book of how that military balance has changed. One of the things that people often say is like, oh, but the United States would stop that invasion, so China would never do it, which just suggests that there is not a deep understanding of how this type of operation would work.
Thanks for clarifying that for me. You mentioned economics, and I was wondering about economic sanctions. They are a foreign policy tool that the United States has long employed, and you note that beginning around 2010, China too has increasingly used this tool. How does China's use of sanctions differ from the US case?
So I put this more in the category of exploitation, like using a U.S. strategy in a different way, because the Chinese use more of these unilateral sanctions to show their discontent about how that country is approaching largely Chinese domestic political situations. That's not really how the United States does it. We're usually showing how we're unhappy with, human rights or other behaviors that go against international norms. But it's not like if a country makes a statement about our immigration policy at home that they would be sanctioned for it. So this is a unique Chinese way. Also, how they do it, right? U.S. sanctions are very direct and open. The U.S. government will put on those sanctions, then we'll say why we're doing it. We'll say when they're going to stop. But Chinese sanctions, for a lot of them are not even official, right? What we see is just the Chinese not engaging in certain types of economic activities or buying certain things. But they might say, no, I mean, we never sanctioned Australia, we never sanctioned South Korea. But it is much more of a political statement of we don't like what you're saying and about China. versus specific types of activities.
That gives us a good entry into economics. I know you're not an economist, but I'm currently editing Michael Beeman's book, Walking Out, which is about how the United States has turned its back on the international system of trade that it helped create. One of the issues that Beeman discusses is domestic disagreement over incorporating values like environmental protection and labor rights into trade agreements. With China's financial might, is the era of being able to export U.S. democratic and other values by relying on economic leverage over?
So I think the United States really hasn't had a clear strategy towards the developing world in particular for a very long period of time. And it is clear in all aspects of the book, whether it is high level visits, where Xi Jinping has visited like the 70% of the poorest countries in Africa, places a US president has never stepped foot, to some of the language about, regime agnosticism that is really popular with the developing world. And again, not just autocracies. We have this view that, autocracies, autocrats want to do whatever they want. And of course, that's the case. But there's also this history in the developing world that they didn't have great experiences, maybe dealing with certain international institutions or with the United States. And they like the idea that China says, "Listen, this is how we did it, and if you want to learn from us, we're happy to tell you how we did it. But we recognize that your country is different, and what you need is different than what we did." And I think we underestimate how powerful of a message that is to the developing world. So again, I don't want to say that we should abandon any sort of support for human rights, but these are things that in some cases can't be forced. And what you want to do is think of the factors that support more democratic principles and then support those factors instead, like building of civil society or helping countries build a stronger education system or do media training for, what a free and open media looks like to certain, to journalists, to encourage that kind of direction versus just saying, either do this and figure it out, or we can't have this type of relationship with you.
Your final chapter is recommendations for the United States. But before that, when you discussed how China approached certain challenges or acted on them, I often thought that such an approach would not work for the United States because of the problem of the 4-year presidential cycle, especially now with the extreme divisions that are manifesting in our culture and our politics. In your introduction, however, you note the other side of the coin, saying, this drive for power and influence is not the only motivation for China's behavior. Unsurprisingly, the Chinese Communist Party's insistence on strong state control to maintain domestic power also shapes how China competes, often in ways that are problematic, both for the US-led world order and for China itself. So I wonder if you could give an example of how the CCP's concern with keeping its place domestically has caused the Chinese government to act against its best interests internationally.
So again, I don't want to make the judgment, what is its best interest is kind of a hard judgment to make. But I would say that there are some things that seem like it makes their strategy less effective. So like the internationalization of the renminbi, most economists would say if they lifted export controls, they'd be much more successful in internationalizing the renminbi. But lifting export controls would undermine aspects of party rule, so it won't be done. Same with, maybe goes against their interests, something like soft power, where, that kind of heavy-handed censorship tends to create certain products that are just not interesting or fun, right? And so they have a hard time promoting soft power largely because of that CCP rule. Now, what I'd like to say is it's not that China is in any way better than the United States at this stuff. It's not like China is more strategic, but what they are better at, I think, is recognizing what their weaknesses are and then not competing in those areas. So it's kind of like when BRI came out, the United States is now trying to compete with China by building infrastructure because China is building infrastructure when we don't have an advantage in that. Is that really the area that we want to compete with China in is, building infrastructure, especially in the developing world? Or do we have different competitive advantages? So I think the Chinese are much more open about what their strengths and weaknesses are. They might say, okay, because we're not a democracy, this isn't going to work for us. But I very rarely hear the United States say, okay, because we are a democracy, this is not the best strategy for us. Let's pursue something different that caters to what we're good at. Right. So I think that is the distinction there, not so much that one system is better than the other in terms of competition for power. Let me be clear that obviously I think democracy is the better system for a lot of other reasons. But when it comes to competing for global power, I think it's more because there are some advantages to both systems. It's your ability to cater to your advantage and avoid competition in areas where you can't compete that really determines how far a country goes.
This touches on my next question. You recommend that the United States commit more funds to developing countries and stop tying development assistance to political reform, to even engage with authoritarian regimes. You say the United States should play the long game. But is that realistic in today's political environment? Some of the flexibility that you illustrate in China's behavior is a product of the one party state. How can the United States compete with that?
Well, I think even harder, even before you get to the duration of a policy, it's whether or not an administration even puts a policy in place. And I think in some cases, our politics even prevents that. Because in government, the way that it kind of works is unless you're 100% sure that something's going to go through and work, right? And so your critics can't, throw you under the bus for it. You don't even want to try it. But the issue with entrepreneurial actions in some cases is it requires a degree of experimentation, right? China went before they, announce Belt and Road or strategic partnerships. They always try a few first and see how they go. It's like telling a company CEO, you need to come up with a strategy for, growth of profits, and you can't deviate from it for the next 45 years, right? Like how well would that company go? Like you have to be able to adjust. And I think one of the difficulties is any adjustment in policy is seen as a failure. So leaders are kind of unwilling to give things a try to be able to even figure out what would be the best approach. Like, hey, maybe it does make sense to enhance our engagement with autocracies instead of disengaging when they're doing things we don't like to try to shape their choices. What would be the best way of doing that? Increasing embassy personnel, having them over for visits, whatever it is. Some of those things might be bad ideas, but it's kind of hard to tell until you've tried it. And so I think our domestic political system not only makes it difficult for policies to continue administration after administration, but it does increase the cost of entrepreneurial thinking for any one administration who even might be interested in implementing a new approach during their 4 years.
So maybe what the United States needs is a spin-off that could take on more risks and respond to these challenges?
Yeah, or just like, leadership. I mean, that's my understanding. It depends how you think about leadership. Is leadership, a US president just doing what the American people say that they want right now? Or is it also creating a vision for the American people and leading them in that direction? Right. We can have different views on that. I tend to follow more the latter. And I think this rise of China and the challenge of China is of such importance and such urgency that you need leaders to put their political aspirations aside and think in this more, calculated strategic way that, you said that in some cases comes out that I think in that way of just like what would be best for the United States in the future, even if in the short term it costs me politically. Like we need that kind of leadership and that kind of courage in our system for us to be able to compete with China.
I know we're running short on time. I wanted to tell you that I had a laugh out loud moment with one of your recommendations.
Okay.
You say that since the United States often enjoys an advantage when China tries to directly emulate its behavior, that, quote, given this situation, the United States should encourage more emulation on China's part, possibly through messaging about how China cannot be considered a legitimate great power until it possesses certain capabilities or engages in certain types of activities. I read this and the image of Tom Sawyer trying to trick people into whitewashing rather, his fence popped into my head. It seems like a real psychological trick. Do you think this could work?
Well, one of the arguments for, when China does deviate from this strategy, right? I've already listed a few of these cases like soft power and the aircraft carrier. Um, it's because they're not considering primarily those five factors I laid out, but instead they seem to be driven by concerns of prestige. So even though it goes against, their interests, it doesn't make sense strategically. They're pouring a lot of money into things, not getting a lot of bang for the buck. It seems like their desire for prestige can make them make irrational decisions. And that's why I actually think it's possible. If you get into that prestige cycle with China and be like, well, you're not really a great power unless you have an aircraft carrier. You're not really a great power unless you have soft power. You're not really a great power until you do certain things that are difficult and costly. That I think it could work. But I think the hardest thing is not so much whether it can work with the Chinese, but getting over our own understandings. Because a lot of what happens with emulation, and one of the reasons China doesn't always do it, is it can often be seen as a direct challenge to US interests. I like to give the example, if 20 years ago China, John Mearsheimer was right and China pursued military alliances with like Mexico, we would have recognized China as a threat much sooner because that's what we do. So part of the reason to do things differently is a lot of research shows that it takes longer to identify those activities and you tend to underestimate them. So when we look at like China building up its nuclear force right now, or speculation about China having overseas bases, this heightens people's threat perceptions and because it's what we do for power. And the immediate response is, how do we make sure China doesn't do these things? But I guess what I'm saying very controversially is actually it would be good for us if China did those things because they would be spending a lot of money in certain areas that would decrease their key power in other areas, and they would not be able to compete with us, like in global power projection, for example.
All right, Dr. Mastro, last question. You've worked on this book for a long time. What's your next project?
Well, I actually I am two-thirds the way through my next book, which is on the history and drivers of China-Russia military alignment and implications for global security. So that's the next project that I'm currently drafting the manuscript for.
Sounds great. Thanks for taking the time out and talking with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.